discussion. So I begin again. Thank you, Gary, for being here. And thank you for bringing your Sabbath school class with you, this Jack Provoncha Legacy Sabbath School. And we are looking forward to a good conversation. This is the first of several such discussions. We plan to do this once a month on the Sabbath, the second Sabbath of every month from here throughout the school year. There are 8 chapters in Gary's most recent book, and we plan to discuss them once a month. So this is the first in that series, and we are happy that everybody's here, and we will get started with reading from Matthew, chapter 6, beginning with verse 25. Therefore, I tell you, do not be worried about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? And why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon, in all his glory, was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore, do not worry, saying, what will we eat, what will we drink, or what will we wear? For it is the Gentiles who strive for all these things, and indeed your heavenly Father knows that you need them, and all other things. But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. So, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today. So we begin with prayer. We notice that, dear God, we notice that as the Gospel of Matthew portrays what Jesus is saying, his line of reasoning seems to be, well, you believe God takes care of the birds, and therefore you should believe God takes care of you. Maybe today it would be the opposite way. Maybe he would say to us, well, you believe God cares for you. You need also to believe that God cares for the birds. Because we talk a lot about your love for us. We sing about that. We talk about it. We argue about it. In any case, your love for us is of overriding significance, but we rarely talk about your love for other members of this planet. Gary's new book, Loving Creation, gives us a chance to take another look at this matter and perhaps have a wider and deeper understanding of your love and what ours can be as well. In Christ's name, amen. Oh, welcome once again, Gary. It looks to me as though you are in a new home.
Well, that's right. We moved this summer.
Has that been a big task?
It has, and it is not over yet.
I was a little alarmed because one of my colleagues posted something on Facebook that compared moving to going into the mountains during the time of trouble. It was so stressful for him, and I suggested to him that maybe this stress was exacerbated by something we have both heard earlier, and that is, in the time of trouble, we might have to stand without a mediator. So here he was making this move, mindful of not always having done exactly the right thing, making this move standing without a mediator. And so that was increasing his anxiety. But I gather you did not have that kind of anxiety.
No, but there's definitely a lot to take care of, a lot to manage here, but also a lot to celebrate. And so we're having fun in this new location, which is not very far from our old location.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of your book before we get into the book. That is, I'd like to ask questions to you about the background of your book before we get into the book itself. As I think about it, it seems to me that there are two primary clusters in your publications. One of them is about Christian theology and ethics, and the other is about legal and political theory. So you get a PhD from Cambridge for part of your work on Christian theology and ethics, and that you get an LLD from Cambridge University for part of your work on legal and political theory. So there are these two different clusters of publications. I think there are. And my question right now is, and I'm going to propose an answer to it so we can keep moving. My question is, what conceptual links, if any, tie these two clusters of your work together? And I'm going to suggest that one of the things, not just one, not the only one, but one of the things is the idea of natural law. That is, one can find the idea of natural law in your theological and ethical writings, but one can find the idea of natural law in your political and legal writings as well. So I see that as a kind of a bridge between the two clusters of material. What do you think?
I think that's right, Dave. I think the underlying kind of moral approach that I've tried to spell out in various places, but notably in this book, is kind of worked out, with more focus on theological matters here, but is the same approach, I think, that comes to expression in my substantive work in legal and political theory. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, so that being the case, I'd like what we've just established so far then is that you are in favor of natural law thinking. And I would like to quickly, not spending much time on this, but quickly mention to you, I see here 6 different ethical theories that would be alternatives to alternatives to natural law theory, and invite you to tell us why you did not go for each one of these. The first one I'm going to mention would be a common morality or a cultural tradition kind of thing. I'm not quite sure what to call this, but I'm thinking of what MacIntyre writes about, that we put a lot of emphasis upon our own heritage, our own traditions when we try to discern what is right or what is wrong. Why didn't you go in that direction?
So I think it's important to distinguish between the particular common morality that happens to be kind of in the air in let's say our particular society. I'm not sure there's just one, but maybe there is. People often seem to suppose that when they talk about common morality, as over against what I think is MacIntyre's point, which is that recognizing our immersion in some tradition is the starting point, is the beginning of wisdom, right? That if we're going to have an intellectual conversation about the grounding of ethics or anything else, we need to recognize that we don't exist in an intellectual vacuum. And MacIntyre himself obviously is not particularly an advocate of that sort of common morality. He instead really is a kind of Thomist. But
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, somebody has not muted his or her mic. Go ahead.
Yeah. Anyway, so but I'd say the difference between that common morality approach that you refer to and what I'm interested in is that I think common morality approach is a bit of a hodgepodge, and it really reflects the interplay of the varied influence of a variety of moral traditions and theories that have influenced different aspects of societal life. And I suppose I'm enough of a rationalist that I'd like to see things fit together a bit more coherently, and at least to see how far we can go with a more consistent and coherently worked out single approach.
Okay, I take your distinction between common morality and cultural traditions that I blurred, and I take that, but let's keep moving. What about divine command theories?
So again, it's probably important to distinguish between a divine command theory as an account of the deep nature of morality on the one hand, and a divine command theory that announces that there are particular divine commands. So it might be the case that a given divine command theory could involve divine commands that turn out to be identical with the moral principles that I defend as part of a natural law theory, but might just treat those as rooted finally in divine commands. Now, I think that the majority Christian tradition over time has been skeptical about divine command approaches for reasons that I think you and I will talk about a little later. But I think I had the short answer, which we'll come back to later, is that I think to talk about God as love and to talk about creation as good is to say that it's not a matter of kind of arbitrary prescription what's right and what's good, but it's a function rather of the way things are. And the divine command theories, as they're characteristically worked out, seem to be looking in the wrong place for accounts of what it is in virtue of which things are right and good.
Okay, so I had in mind not divine commands that inform us about the structures of the real world, but divine commands that establish the legitimacy of the command by virtue of it having been commanded by God. So we keep moving. What about utilitarianism?
So utilitarianism, I object to pretty vigorously, because utilitarianism calls us to maximize something. Different variants of utilitarianism want us to maximize different things. The standard traditional 19th century view was pleasure or happiness. Other variants give us different approaches there. But I think the basic problem with utilitarianism is that there's a good case to be made for the view that there are lots of different ways in which our lives can go well, and that these can't be reduced to any one thing of the kind that you'd need if you were going to have a kind of maximizing approach like utilitarianism. And so friendship and aesthetic experience and knowledge and play and various other things are all valuable aspects of life, and they're all qualitatively different. They're all incapable, I think, of being measured on the same scale, because there's no underlying quality that they're all embodying that they all can be measured against. And so therefore, the whole utilitarian project, I think, can't get off the ground in the first place.
Okay, now parenthetically, we're pushing toward the problem of evil, and I put up on Facebook a report of the 85 people whose lives were lost in the Camp Fire in Northern California, and there are names and there are pictures and there are accounts of where their bodies were found. It's quite sobering, actually. And one of those victims was a classmate of mine in high school, so it has a personal interest, and that we'll come back to as we move toward the end of our discussion. But I want to have us keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, now what about ethical egoism?
So ethical egoism, as it's ordinarily worked out, seems to involve inviting people to pursue whatever their own preferences happen to be. And So I think if we can, if we're to understand, first of all, what human flourishing looks like, I think we'll understand that human flourishing is more than simply a matter of preference satisfaction. There are lots of different ways in which, as I've just noted, I think our lives can go well. And I think if we seek to flourish, we will seek to flourish by reasoning well and choosing well about a whole range of different goods, about a whole different range of ways in which lives can go well. And in the course of doing that, we'll unavoidably take seriously and respectfully the reality and the well-being of those other than ourselves. So we don't live in a kind of moral vacuum, and precisely as we seek to flourish and to flourish in relationships, but also just to choose well, we will acknowledge that others are real and that their flourishing is real and matters as well.
Okay, just two more. Intuitionism, as in W.D. Ross.
Yeah, so Ross's view here, again, we often talk about intuitionism, which is really a kind of epistemological position, but how we might know things. But Ross's view really is a kind of moral pluralism that includes a lot of different elements. It's not really clear how those elements are supposed to fit together. Ross thinks we've got a variety of, as he says, prima facie duties, but those prima facie duties obviously in different cases can conflict, and we can find a proponent of this approach saying, well, it's just a matter of judgment how we resolve tensions among them in particular cases, but that often seems to be difficult to justify and to come close to just a matter of operating on instinct or arbitrariness. Again, my hope is that we can seek a more coherent approach that allows us to make judgments that take adequately into account all of the relevant principles and goods without having to rely, I think, in the way that the Rossian pluralist would on really on instinct.
Okay, one more. I guess the right word would be formalism, but I'm thinking of Kantianism.
Yeah. So if we think about Kant in particular, there's a lot to be said for a view like Kant's. But what I think isn't there, at least in the standard readings of Kant, is a rich conception of human well-being. That Kant seems to be more concerned with the naked will than with simple kind of objects of choice that are differentiated just because of our inclinations toward them, than he is with rich aspects of human flourishing and fulfillment and well-being, and so. The kind of natural law approach I'd want to advance certainly has elements that don't seem very far off from Kant's, but also builds fundamentally on the Aristotelian tradition, which has obviously been so central for natural law thinking from Aristotle through Aquinas and after, with its strong emphasis on a substantive conception of human well-being, on flourishing, on fulfillment, and not just on choosing in accordance with the right formal specifications.
Okay, that's a smooth transition to natural law theories. And as I think about that matter, I sort of think about your work as a third generation of natural law thinking. That is, we have Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas representing the first generation. And then we have the so-called new natural lawyers in the 20th century representing the second generation. And then we have your work that I would consider moving beyond even the second generation to what I'm inclined to call a third generation of natural law thinking. First of all, is that generally correct? And if so, how would you characterize each of those generations?
Yeah, so there's obviously an enormously complex lineage to be talked about here, from Aristotle, who develops an account of ethics that is rooted in flourishing, and at the same time, very much rooted in the contemporary practice of the Greek city-state, which he then tries to rationalize, to render explicit and self-consciously reflective, and so forth. To Aquinas, who becomes the most important participant in the revival of interest in Aristotle's thought in the 13th century, and who tries to show how a broadly Aristotelian approach to virtue in particular can capture key elements of Christian ethics as he understands them. And then, of course, you've got a range of thinkers in that Aristotelian Thomist tradition from the 13th century on to the present. But I think Dave is right to highlight the work of Germain Grisey and then his collaborators and successors as important for my own work. And that might seem a little odd, and so it's worth maybe just stopping for a second to talk about this. It might seem odd to anybody who's aware of Grisey, because I'm a liberal Protestant. Grisey is was a pretty conservative Catholic, and we'd certainly find things to butt heads about. But what Grisey, I think, was interested in doing was to take the natural law tradition, which he really respected and appreciated, and bring it into conversation with kind of post-World War II so-called analytic moral philosophy, with moral philosophy focused on clarity of expression and rigor of argument and so forth. The tradition that is influenced especially by figures like G.E. Moore, and Grisey recognized that there was a long and continuing tradition well after Aquinas of natural law thinkers. I think he started out imagining that what he was doing was simply explicating Aquinas, but then he realized that he had begun to develop a moral theory of his own, which ultimately became very influential on a lot of conversations, certainly within Catholicism over the past 50 plus years. That he exerted that influence, especially, I suppose, through the work of John Finnis, who was not a student of Grisey's, who was a philosopher of law with a kind of, who was himself a convert to Catholicism, became very interested, I think, in Catholic intellectual rigor and vigor, discovered Grisey's work and embraced it and used it to spell out an independent philosophy of law in an area that Grisey himself had not really worked in. Otherwise, the two were almost indistinguishable. I think the only area I can think of regarding which they had any meaningful disagreement was that Grisey always opposed capital punishment. Finnis started out thinking that you could reconcile capital punishment with their shared variety of natural law theory. Grisey became a little more accommodating, and Finnis became rather less accommodating in that regard. It took on not only the kind of standard sort of bioethical concerns that have been very significant for many conservative Catholics, with things like abortion. They also adopted and tried to defend in non-standard but interesting and rigorous ways very conservative positions, like the prescription of contraception that had been expressed by Pope Paul VI, and similarly they opposed same-sex erotic relationships, same-sex marriage, and so forth. They took consistently very conservative positions, but in very interesting ways that developed the Aristotelian Thomist approach. And then there was a later kind of cadre of folks, notably Finnis's student Robert P. George, who's gone on to teach at Princeton University. Finnis taught for years at Oxford. who've continued to kind of develop these ideas in one direction, and typically in a quite conservative Catholic direction. So what I'm trying to do, first of all, is to more explicitly cast the approach theologically. Now, this is something that Grisey went on to do in some later work, but his early work was more directly philosophical, and then he went back and kind of reworked it to make clear its theological resonances. So the approach that I've taken is a kind of liberal Protestant reworking of this Catholic conservative Catholic approach, and I suppose it's noteworthy because one of the very first things I ever published in legal and political philosophy was a defense of same-sex marriage in opposition to the stance that these so-called new classical natural law thinkers had taken. And that led to my trying to work out over time what how to kind of work out the theory if one weren't going to follow these thinkers down the same kind of conservative path that they had taken, while still retaining the heart of their concern with justice and flourishing. So we'll talk about those details, but that's perhaps even more detail than you want in response to that initial question, David.
Okay, one last question by way of background, and that is, Catholics over the years have emphasized natural law, as you have mentioned, but Protestants, on the other hand, have typically talked more about love. And in your work, you're trying to move beyond that division and come up with something that integrates them both without violating the best insights of each. I think that's what's going on in your book.
That's right. Yeah. So while, obviously there are lots of different varieties of Protestant ethics, and for that matter of Catholic ethics, I think it is right to say that natural law thinking has been very important in Catholic moral theology, and especially, of course, after Aquinas was officially designated the as it were, kind of philosopher, theologian in chief of the Catholic Church in the 19th century. Protestants often focused on a range of themes and approaches and lenses, including certainly divine commands. Protestants often found themselves working out ethics, drawing, say, on the Decalogue. If you look at a lot of the 20th century figures like Emil Brunner and Dietrich Bonhoeffer from the pre-World War II era, they've often got, in addition to the commands that are embodied in the Decalogue, they'll often talk about commands like ones that they see underlying various sorts of social structures and institutions. They've talked about things like divine mandates. This was a common expression in that era, and so here it wasn't. They might have said that the mandates were expressed explicitly in the Bible, or they might have said that the mandates came to expression in social institutions as they developed in particular ways. But in addition to this, it became increasingly common for Protestants to say that love was the dominant and indeed perhaps only thing that mattered in moral reflection. And this led from just perhaps more general and unfocused talk about love to certainly, for instance, the very influential work of kind of intellectual history and theology, Agape and Eros by Anders Nygren, that tried to suggest that there were two very different conceptions of love in the intellectual and spiritual history of the West. That Eros, love of desire, reached up to God. Agape, love as gift came down from God, and that a proper spirituality was one that received divine gift rather than trying to, as it were, ascend up to God with eros in this way. But then in practical terms, people came increasingly to talk about particular conception of agape. We'll get back to this in connection with a later chapter of the book. And this came to expression, this idea of agape as kind of pure gift came to expression in a variety of ethical contexts, but notably in Paul Ramsey's book, Basic Christian Ethics in the 1950s, that really offered an account of love that seemed hard sometimes to distinguish from a certain sort of utilitarianism, except a utilitarianism that wasn't interested in maximizing overall well-being, but rather was interested in maximizing overall well-being, ignoring the well-being of the agent. The agent might just kind of benefit along the way, but was supposed to be completely taken out of the picture. It was kind of radically self-effacing. But then in the 1960s, you had Joe Fletcher offering in Situation Ethics an account of love at the heart of Christian ethics that was really explicitly utilitarian. And we find Ramsey kind of backing up and in effect saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't quite think I intended to go that way. And Ramsey begins to develop his own view in a fashion that's much more, it seems to me, like traditional natural law views. And it was being aware of this discussion of love in Protestant ethics and what seemed to be its deficiencies, but also being very much aware of the limits to natural law thinking among Catholics, that prompted me to work out this book in the way that I did, to try to say, is there a way of thinking about love that doesn't turn into a kind of holy utilitarianism and a variety of natural law thinking that isn't just a matter of sort of submission to the perceived, natural teleologies of things, but that really is concerned instead with human well-being. So that's how things got started, I guess, with this project.
Good. I said that was the last one, but I actually have one more, and that is, you mentioned quite frequently that Jack Provoncha had an impact on your thinking early on, and still does. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really delighted to be here with members of the Jack Provoncha Legacy Sabbath School class with our monthly add-on to the Branson Legacy class. Jack, of course, probably made a name for himself outside of Adventism, first and foremost as a very incisive commentator on matters bioethical. But it seems to me within Adventism, Jack worked in a whole range of areas in philosophical theology and in theological ethics. And I think he was one of the first people I read when, as an adolescent, I started kind of trying to think my way into theology. And certainly his great first book, God is With Us, talks a great deal about the centrality of creation thinking to ethics. And he makes the point in an even more focused way in his chapter on creation in the collection Remnant and Republic that Charles Steele edited, emerging from a lecture series that some of us will remember from 1988, to which, of course, Dave, you contributed a great essay on sanctuary. And so I think Jack repeatedly emphasized that a proper understanding of ethics needed to be rooted in creation, and that we needed to do our best to avoid any conception of God as a sort of arbitrary tyrant imposing prescriptions on people, but that instead we needed to see ethics as a matter of how we'd been created. And I think I discovered the way Jack talked about that early on, and I'm quite sure that the way he framed things, has continued to be influential on me. And one of the perhaps less explicitly stated goals that I have for this book is to remind people that Jack had interesting things to say. So I try to spend a significant portion of one chapter dialoguing with his work, because I think his emphasis on creation as the heart of ethics really set me on the right track, and I continue to be very grateful for that.
Okay, all of those questions were background to your book. Have I failed to ask a good question about the background to your book before we turn to the book itself?
I think anything we need to talk about will come out as we keep talking about the book.
Okay, let's begin with the simple question. Why did you write it?
So it's always hard to answer that question perfectly, I think. But in the fall of 2020, I was dusting off my dissertation on friendship and the later material I had written, with the idea that it would end up in a book version of that dissertation. I had really set that project to one side for a very long time, and with the enforced inactivity that I think a lot of us were experiencing in that period, I focused on writing. And so I was thinking more about theological writing for whatever reason. I was thinking more about theological issues when I produced that little book on the idea of an Adventist university that we talked about in this class. I was working on tidying up my theology book, The Analogy of Love. And I thought, I'm going to see if I can do something with that friendship book that I've set to one side for a long time. And indeed, I was able to find a publisher for the book and finish work on it. One of the things I did in that book was to talk about something that I've talked about with Dave and with this group in the past, to think about a kind of model of love operating within not quite concentric circles, sometimes concentric, but sometimes overlapping. Moving from the kind of love as devotion that we might have for a child or a spouse, all the way out to love as respect that we might have for the vast number of strangers we encounter or don't encounter on an ongoing basis. And as I thought about that and just kind of worked it out briefly, just as one alternative in the book on friendship, I realized that it would be easy to kind of begin to develop that as a book on its own. And I pitched that idea to the editor I had been working with at Fortress, and he was favorably disposed to that. I had been thinking a lot, certainly, about natural law thinking, natural law theory, and I thought I saw a way in which natural law theory could provide a bridge between the Protestant and Catholic thinkers, who had been, had all been influential on me. But love and creation, I thought could bridge some gaps there, and it seemed to me that I was just spending a lot of time thinking again as I worked on that book about the Protestant theological ethical debates about love that had gone on earlier in the century that still were quite influential for me. I thought there certainly was insightful and important work going on there. And so I think I wrote the book in part because I had the idea that I could expand this conception of love, the sort of model of love that I'd worked out in the friendship book, and partly because I thought I saw a way in which this conflict between love and natural law could be resolved. And I thought it would be fun to spell out what that would look like in concrete terms.
Okay, let's look at the title. You said you have the title, Loving Creation, the Task of the Moral Life. Now, what do you mean by the word love?
So love, in the broadest sense here, is appropriate regard for well-being, as I suggest early on in the book. That's what when I talk about love, that's what I have in mind.
could you say more about appropriate regard for well-being?
Sure. Can you say? I'm not sure where your question's headed, Dave. Sorry.
Okay. Talk a little bit about well-being. What do you have in mind there?
Okay. Can I just say something? Back up a little bit.
Sure. Go ahead.
Before we do that, I want to say I picked the title of this book. I didn't pick the subtitle, and I'm not really very happy with the subtitle. So I don't. But I suppose in some sense I need to take ownership of the subtitle because here we are, and I didn't make a fuss about it. But I think the title of the book I suggested was "Loving Creation: An Essay in Christian Ethics," and I deliberately had in mind that the expression "loving creation" was and is ambiguous. Right. So we talk about loving creation. I can mean the activity of engaging in love for creation, or I can mean talking about, on the other hand, creation as inherently loving, or I can mean, I mean, those are the two most obvious things, but I had in mind a focus on different ways of thinking about creation. Is creation, kind of inherently loving? Is creation the object of love? And by choosing the subtitle, The Task of the Moral Life, the editor, I think, wanted to suggest that I just had one of those things in mind. And I really, really wanted to have a broader conception of creation as loving as well as creation as loved. In any case, your question about well-being. So love is appropriate regard for well-being. I think that the idea here is that for a sentient creature, there are ways that its life goes well, and there are ways that its life doesn't go well. Right. So, and I suggest that for creatures put together in the way we've been put together, well-being has a bunch of dimensions that might include, and I don't need to list all of them, but might include everything from life and bodily well-being to friendship, to play, to self-integration, having a life that hangs together, to aesthetic experience, to something like, we might say, harmony with ultimate reality, harmony with reality, so as not to kind of bias things in advance, and so forth. Well-being here then is a range of different aspects of one's life, in virtue of which we can say that life is going well or not going well. We can talk, I think, not perhaps as perfect synonyms, but certainly as close to perfect synonyms about well-being, about welfare, about flourishing, about fulfillment, about self-realization. All of these things fundamentally, I think, have to do with the same thing, which is kind of expressing our created potential. Okay, so we have certain capacities, we have certain things that we're capable of, and we flourish as we're able to express that potential. And we can identify these, I guess, in a variety of ways. We can think about, I think if we ask, what is it to say that somebody got injured, right? Then we can think about what aspect of that person's life was injured, by anything from a relational rupture to an auto accident that might result in broken bones and internal injuries and so forth. Or we might think about if you're trying to give good advice to somebody who's trying to make a decision, you think about what aspects of that person's well-being you're picking up on when you give that advice with an eye to a career or a marriage or an employment decision or any number of other things. What kind of advice we might give a loved one and how that advice targets an aspect of well-being. And so I suggest in the book several different alternate paths to kind of getting at what seemed to me to be our judgments about when things are going well in our own lives or in the lives of other people. And I don't have a formula. I don't have some kind of metaphysical theory from which I'm going to deduce a particular account of well-being. But I think just as we can look at a plant and say, the plant seems to be flourishing, or we can look at, a non-human animal and say the animal seems to be flourishing. I think we can do that with ourselves as well.
Okay, now this question may not be posed in the right way, but I would like you to talk a little bit about appropriate regard. And maybe one could contrast the idea of appropriate regard for the well-being of those we love with the idea of reverence for life. Is there a similarity or is there a difference between appropriate regard and reverence for life, as we see in the writings of Albert Schweitzer?
So the question about Schweitzer is interesting. I don't feel like I know the Schweitzer corpus well enough to clearly distinguish what I'd want to say from his position. I feel like if I said I think Schweitzer's doing X and I'm doing Y, I would just be afraid I would be frankly just making that up because I don't know enough to say. The expression reverence for life, if we just disconnect it from Schweitzer's own elaborate and developed position, I guess I would distinguish in several ways, right? It's the most important is that the view of appropriate regard for well-being, whether our own or that of others. It seems much broader than a concern with life, unless reverence for life really means reverence for living things. But if it means specifically for that one aspect of well-being that is life, then I think that's much narrower than I would want to be. If we're talking about living things generally, then again, I guess then we're talking about sort of defining the scope of moral concern. And there I would say, as readers of the book will find, one thing I want to do in the book is to argue, say, with Jack Provoncha about the need for a broader scope of concern with sentient life, rather than in a more narrow way just with human life. I think there are sentients in our world who absolutely deserve our concern, as Alicia and I have been reminded this week, trying to deal with the challenges faced by one of our cats who's diabetic. So I think we certainly want to be concerned with more lives than just with human lives. But I think concern with life more broadly, when it's not specified in some more narrow way, I think I wouldn't probably want to go down that path. I don't think that a sort of biocentric ethic that just treats all varieties of life as on on an even keel really would capture what I'm trying to say here.
Well, I thought that was that last point is what I thought was the difference, or not the difference, but a difference, and that is, it is the case that Schweitzer puts, I think he would say, equal regard for all living things. Not appropriate regard for all living things, but equal regard for all living things. And that puts him in the situation of having to violate equal regard for all living things in order to live, and other people or other animals have to violate that too in order for them to live. But one does that with a sense of guilt. One does not do that with any sense of moral justification. We ought to regard all living beings in an equally significant way. But you're not saying that. You're saying that it's got to be appropriate. And I would think that the regard we have for a mouse might be different than the regard we have for a cat. And the regard we have for a cat might be different from the regard we have for a child.
Yeah, and of course we'll talk more about that in connection with what I have to say about Jack's view. Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to say, first of all, I'm interested in sentient life. So I limit things. Now, I mean, obviously, just where those lines get drawn is a, broadly speaking, an empirical matter, and maybe I'm wrong about where that happens to be in the world of existence. But I definitely don't think that meeting the scientific definition of life is sufficient to merit kind of membership in the moral community. I do think that the basic idea, the basic prescription on purposeful attack, for instance, does apply anytime we're talking about a sentient. But that's, again, we'll come to that later in the book. So yeah, I wouldn't want to go down Schweitzer's path there.
Okay, all right. Now it's almost time for us to take a break, but I have here several couplets that I was hoping for you to talk about. We've talked about love and well-being, but another one would be nature and grace. Another one would be God and the universe. Another one would be our love for ourselves and our love for others. Another one would be God's love for God's self and God's love for us. Another one would be creation and redemption. And another one would be providence and evil. And another one after that would be providence and the inspiration of the Bible. Now, I was aiming to end up with providence and evil. And yet, if we jump all the way ahead to that, we will miss these other things. So what do you think? When we come back from the break, should we run quickly at least through these other polarities and then get up to providence and evil, or should we just jump ahead right to providence and evil right away? What do you think?
I think I'd like to start with providence and evil and then see where we go from there.
Okay, let's take a break. In about 10 minutes, we'll reconvene. Let's say in about 12 minutes. It's 11:28 here in California time. And so if we get together at about 11:40, about 12 minutes from now, we'll come back and we'll talk about providence and evil. And let's keep in mind the 85 victims of the Camp Creek Road fire. And I will put on the chat a link for that article. And if during the 10 minutes people can click on that and just scroll down, see the pictures of those who died in that fire, and read where their bodies were found and how often their bodies were found next to the bodies of their pets, or that they were trying to get into their automobiles when they perished. Or in one case, a grandmother was phoning her grandson saying, the electricity is off and I cannot lift up the garage door on my own. I need the electricity to open up the garage door, and it's too heavy for me to open up on her own. Of course, she died. They're just stories after stories like that. And if we have any idea that God has any love, we need to start thinking about this issue, as you say in your book, at least in a preliminary fashion. At least in a preliminary fashion. So, okay, let's take a break, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes now.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for coming back from the break, and we continue our conversation with Gary Chartier and his book, Loving Creation, The Task of the Moral Life. Before we took a break, he mentioned that his subtitle for the book, The Task for the Moral Life, was not one that he chose, and that is not one that he particularly enjoys. And I want to say that I agree with him on that. And I don't know why he has some reservations about the title, but the idea of the moral life being a task did not sit well with me. I thought maybe the joy of the moral life, or the opportunity of the moral life, or the fun of the moral life. Anyway, something other than the task of the moral life would appeal to me more. Now, toward the end of this chapter, though, Gary deals with the problem of evil. And what struck me as significant in his writings was a twofold thing. One, he shows how, at least to my satisfaction, how there is a real sense that if God is going to have something other than God with which or with whom to be companionable, by definition, that actuality has to have some freedom. It's not as though God could create beings other than God who have no freedom, because if that were the case, these other beings would not be distinct from God, but they would be mere extensions of God. So if God wants to have those other than God with whom to be in companionship, by necessity, not by choice, but by necessity, those other beings have to have some measure of freedom. That's the first point. And I hope that Gary can correct me on that if I'm wrong. The second point that I found interesting is that he pointed out a relationship that I had not previously noticed. And that is the way we answer the problem of suffering parallels the way we answer our understanding of the Bible's inspiration. Now, once I read it, I said to myself, aha, yet again, Gary has pointed out something that's so obviously true that I wonder why I didn't notice it earlier. But that has been my experience for 40 years almost. We've been discussing these matters since 1984. So repeatedly over those years, I have learned from Gary. I have learned to see from Gary things that have always been there, but I just didn't notice. And this is this parallel between how we deal with the problem of suffering and how we understand the inspiration of the Bible is one of those things. So with that sort of background in mind, and keeping in view the horrors of the Camp Creek Road fire, and those 85 people, one of whom was a classmate of mine, Ellen Walker was a classmate of mine, and she was found deceased in her home. Very sad for me, because Ellen was a woman of sorrows and acquainted with grief. From high school on, she had had a number of setbacks, and yet at our 50th high school anniversary, it was clear that she had overcome those adversities, and she attributed the strength that she had from her relationship with God. And I wonder what she was thinking in those last moments of her life. God had led her all the way, and now seemingly abandoned her to those flames. I hope against hope that she died of asphyxiation before she was actually burned. That's what I hope. But in any case, in any event, in any situation like this, one cannot help but feel a sense of horror and grief. But in Ellen's case, my sense of horror and grief is intensified by how many adversities she had encountered and how many she had overcome with, she said, with the presence of God. Where was God in those last moments? Now, I don't know where we go from here. If there's anything there you want to pick up on, Gary, or if anybody else wants to, that would be fine with me. But that's just sort of where I was when I read your chapter. I thought about my friend Ellen Walker.
Yeah. Well, you introduced this by saying that I deal with the problem of evil, and that seems maybe to give me more credit than I deserve. I think we all understand that to say something wise and thoughtful and helpful, both existentially and intellectually about this, is profoundly taxing and profoundly challenging. And I don't think for a moment then that I can, especially in just a one portion of one chapter of a book on another topic, say anything that's going to be profoundly illuminating. But I guess what I do want to say, and this is maybe what's most relevant here, is that whatever else we say about God's presence and activity in the world, we have to say what we say with an eye to the reality of the kinds of stories that you just highlighted, Dave. And so I think there are certain kinds of views we might, because they're not here to defend themselves, pick on scholastic Calvinism or on a certain, I think, traditional variety of Islam, in accordance with which everything that happens in the world happens as a result of the kind of, a kind of unfolding of divine providence. And if you have that view, then there are lots of other things that you can say that are consistent with that view, right? If everything that happens because as a matter of the unfolding of divine providence, then, for instance, it's totally reasonable for a scholastic Calvinist like the Swiss theologian, the Swiss Turretin, to articulate a view of God's revelation to the world, and in particular God's communication to the world through the Bible, in which God determines unilaterally what's likely to, not what's likely, sorry, I was just distracted by something, determine unilaterally what happens. And so what each writer puts down on the page, and how each writer's text is copied, and so forth. So if you embrace this view that we might call meticulous providence, in which divine providence is without qualification responsible for everything that happens, then certainly if you pick anything in particular, and if you pick, say, for instance, the construction of the Bible, then you'll certainly say that's a product of meticulous providence, because everything else is, and here's how God works in the world. God determines everything that happens, so God determined that this would happen. And so we get the kind of inerrantist view of the Bible that is the stock in trade of scholastic Calvinism and its heirs, and so it's unsurprising that you get again a similar kind of view in a kind of traditional variant of Islam. When we listen to a story like the one that Dave has just reminded us of, I think we almost certainly will, and I think certainly should, find it difficult to embrace that scholastic Calvinist view of meticulous providence. We should find it profoundly difficult, because on that view, the horrific events noted in Dave's remarks and in the article to which he linked are themselves products of not just inadvertent products, but deliberate products of divine action. Divine, this is providence at work. Everything that happens is providence at work, and I think it's a tough nut to swallow. So what I try to suggest here, without kind of any illusion that I can sort out the relevant metaphysical and theological issues with any kind of confidence or definitiveness, I try to say at least this: whatever else we say, we ought to say that divine action in the world is such that the character of divine action in the world, the nature of divine action in the world, is such that God's intentions are frequently not realized in the world. They're frequently indeed frustrated in the world. And there are different ways we can try to understand that. And I think we can say that with some confidence. We can look at events like this and say, that's got to be the case. If we then want to go on from there to say, well, why is that? How do we make sense of that? So two things. I don't think we can do so with any confidence, number one. Number two, for the purposes of this conversation, I don't think we need to. What we do need to say is, there are different kinds of accounts we might offer. And I know that one of those might be an account that says, this is, it's just the kind of the nature of the way things are, because things are the way they are. There's an inherent capacity for resistance in one way or another on the part of finite realities to God's persuasive influence. Creatures can't be other than that they can say no. On the other hand, there might be a nearby view, but a different view that would say, well, in principle, perhaps God could override creatures saying no at God's discretion, but there are reasons to do with say, divine goodness, in virtue of which that doesn't happen. There are good reasons, say, for God to want a reliable, orderly background to free creaturely action, and therefore to not upend that background. I don't think either of those is a thing you want to say to someone in a hospital bed or at a graveside, and I don't profess to have worked either out in the kind of detail and with the kind of rigor that it deserves. I just want to make the point here that if you have that kind of conception of divine action, one in which for one reason or another, creation sometimes pushes back, then it seems to me sorry, hold on just a second. Somebody's at the door.
While he's checking the door, let me make a point that I think it's important here, and that is we need to remember the difference between what Jesus did when he was at the tomb of Lazarus. Right? When he was at the tomb of Lazarus, he did not get into a discussion like this, but he wept with the weeping. But on another occasion, I think it's Luke 12 or 13, Jesus does get into this discussion with his disciples, and he presses them. He says, what about the tower that fell on the people, an earthquake? Did God do that? And then he asks, what about the people, the soldiers killed in the temple? Was that part of God's plan? And as I read the text, it gives me the impression that Jesus kept forcing that question. They were in a seminar like we're in now. But when Jesus was in the midst of people who were suffering, as Gary previously indicated before he took off for a moment, when he was implied, I should say, when he was in the presence of those who were suffering, he did not engage in the kind of conversation we are having now, but he wept with the weeping. And yet there is a time and place to have the kind of conversation we're having now. But as Gary said, it's not at the bedside and it's not at the graveside. Okay, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, so I think if we start out then with the recognition that this is the case, we're not that divine action encounters in one way or another pushback. That doesn't mean that we are therefore relegated to what we might call a kind of deist conception of divine action in the world. The deist, at least as a matter of stereotype, I'm sure you could find people we could describe as deists who didn't take just this view, but the sort of standard deist view in the 18th century would have been that the physical world is a great mechanical clock with all the intricacy and all the regularity of a great mechanical clock, and God's majesty and wisdom are shown in God's ability to set the mechanical clock going, but precisely not to interfere with it. And indeed, if God needed to interfere with it, as the deists would have had it, to kind of jigger the works of the mechanical clock, that would show that God hadn't made a perfect clock in the first place. And so on the deist view, then the important thing is just to see God in the creation of this orderly, intricate, beautifully intricate structure. But I think, understandably, for most religious people, Christians, but also people associated with other traditions that affirm belief in God, that hasn't been a satisfactory way of thinking or talking. If there's no sense that divine action can be responsive to the particulars of people's lives in one way or another, then there really can be a sense of alienation and isolation, and really the sense that God isn't love and God isn't concerned with the world. So on the one hand, I think if we're going to say God is love, then we have to say that there must be a gap between God's intentions and what goes on in the world, because we see a world that so frequently doesn't seem to embody anything we could imagine as divine love. On the other hand, if we're going to affirm that God is love, we also have to say that this doesn't mean a kind of detached absence from the world. And to see God as creator is to see God, therefore, as present and active in the world. But we need an account of divine action that's consistent with the recognition that divine intentions are persistently flouted, frustrated, not realized. And so again, I think working out the metaphysics here requires a lot more time and space than I've tried to take in this book. But I would just say we absolutely can continue to affirm a view of divine action as engaged, but I think it has to be, broadly speaking, divine action as persuasive, and therefore divine action such that creatures say no. We might there's certainly more to be said about that, but in any case, so as Dave notes, then when I reflect on divine communication with the world, obviously that's not limited for Christians any more than for adherents of other traditions. That's certainly not limited to one pathway of revelation. Indeed, we think about John 1 famously declares that the Logos incarnate in Christ, that the Logos is the light that enlightens everyone. Divine revelation is ongoing and active everywhere. But if we focus on what God seeks to accomplish in and through the history of Israel and the church, and therefore through the Bible, it's just important to recognize that while God can obviously influence people to bring to expression new insights and profound sensibilities, nonetheless, there's no way to know, once you stop being a scholastic Calvinist, that there's any a priori capacity to, or any a priori guarantee of kind of getting the insights right there, given that human finitude, fallibility, and sin are in play in the reception and the transmission of any message that God seeks to convey to us. Now, Dave generously thanks me for calling this point to his attention. I, in turn, need to thank some other people, the ones to whom I give, I think, the most credit in the book probably are the brothers David and Randall Basinger, who certainly kind of thought through this in a way, in an article, and a couple of articles that I footnote in the book that served as kind of sources of an aha moment for me. But in any case, whatever we say here, when we think about these ethical questions, I think we have to have an adequate understanding of divine action in the background.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. That's it for me, Forrest. Do you have somebody who would like to get involved here?
Yes, I have Simona who has her hand raised. So Simona.
Thank
and
you.
I see in my corner that Anastasia raises her hand too. So, and
Peter.
Go ahead, Simona.
Thank you. David, first of all, I'm so sorry for the loss of your friend. That there is nothing I can say that will make this feel better.
Thank you. Thank you.
This being said, evil is illogical. If we could rationally explain, point A to point B, why something happened, it wouldn't feel so evil. And I think that is part of why we struggle so much with it, because there is this huge gap between things that we can intellectually understand or accept and things that we emotionally feel. And that gap becomes bigger when we become personally involved. Because if it's somebody you love, somebody you have a relationship with, there is a big difference losing someone like that, or knowing just intellectually that somebody X, Y, Z died somewhere of something. So this personal involvement, it makes things different. And I think it's, in a way, it's a price of love. The more you love somebody, the more difficult it is to accept when something bad happens. And that is actually the point of the first thing that I wanted to point out, that the love is relational. We can have love as a principle, but that principle is so overarching that it kind of is very amorphous, and it becomes real, practical, when it's applied. So if I would take, for example, Gary, your example of your cat, while you may like all cats, the fact that your cat is sick makes this difficult, because you have a relationship, and that relationship with your cat is based on acceptance of responsibility that you have undertaken when you entered into relationship with your pet. And so I think that is even more magnified when we speak about relationships with people, because these are creatures who are equal to us in all ways, or at least that we can understand the best. And so it is more horizontal. And that relationship is what actually makes things both beautiful and difficult. I would like to point out that if love is not inherently ethical, it is not love. And there's one of my favorite writers, Bell Hooks. She wrote in her trilogy, New Visions, particularly the first book, all about love. She speaks of love ethics as as being a form of ethics. And I think these two items have to be cohesively together, that love has to be ethical. So for example, just something that I read about this week, for example, that in a county in Alabama, people are incarcerating pregnant women to, quote unquote, protect the fetus. That is inherently unethical and therefore cannot be a sign of any love, let alone love towards the fetus, right? So these two things have to be in a balance. And the final thing that I wanted to say is that when there is an event that challenges us, like this fire, it is a human attempt, and a human instinct is to step away, to try and rationalize, to try to create a distance between the pain that we would normally feel. But God is inviting us to take a step forward, to come closer, and to stand there and to be with the people who are suffering and to feel with them. And even if we don't have the words, to just be there in silence. And I think this is a very powerful lesson for me personally that I have learned about how God acts in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, for characteristically engaging thoughtfully and reflectively and personally with with the conversation here. I think just briefly, because of course there are other people who want to dive in here and so forth, but I would say in response to your observations that yeah, I think that of course what I'm trying to spell out in the book here is exactly an inherently ethical or an inherently moralized conception of love, right? I'm not interested. I think we often talk about love in other ways, and there may be other contexts in which that's totally appropriate, but that's certainly why I'm interested in this very, very generic characterization of love as appropriate regard for well-being, and thus certainly as acceptance of responsibility. I think that's totally appropriate as an observation about something that's part of love as we recognize it, as we want to affirm it. When we think about love in that way, as I noted in response to Dave's initial question, I started thinking about this in relation to the idea of, as it were, concentric circles, but not quite concentric, because there are various kinds of overlaps, but various sorts of overlapping circles. And we can absolutely think about those as, at least in significant part, kind of differentiations of responsibility, different kinds of responsibility expressed in different ways. And certainly, I think the idea that presence, the power of presence, can be a way of caring, a way of loving, when other kinds of responses are unavailable or inadequate, seems very important indeed. I always, when someone I know has undergone a loss, I find myself almost just as a matter of routine, beginning anything I say with some observation to the effect that, I never know what to say here. And that's probably right, but there's a sense in which, while it's obviously important not to presume too much about the value of our words, on the other hand, I think you're quite right to say that just being present, and sometimes when we're not physically there, words can be a way of being present, can be tremendously important. When I think about what happened to me on the occasion, I think about the losses that I've undergone, I think, of course, especially of my wife, Eleanor. I suppose what I most wanted was to hear from people who knew her and could refresh and enliven my memories of her, and thus make me feel closer to her. But of course, it was richly important to hear from anybody. Anyway, yeah. So maybe that's it for now.
Okay, thank you, Gary. I'm going to go to Peter now. Peter.
Thank you, Gary, for the presentation, and congratulations for the publication of your book. I have two things now, and I have two other things for later on, because I want to give other people time. The first one is, how do you interpret the statement, we do moral things because they are moral per se, or because God tells us so? And the second thing that I'd like you to comment is that you made the statement that in one of your books, you defended the same-sex marriage. And could you tell us the ethical principles that you will bring in favor of that? These two now, and later on I have two other things.
Well, there's a lot there, Peter, and what I'm going to say, I think, in response to the second question is definitely going to be crisp and brief, given the limited amount of time here. With regard to the first observation, I really like an observation that C.S. Lewis makes. This is in an essay called "The Poison of Subjectivism," which I find myself, which I note in the book here. Lewis says, if good is to be defined as what God commands, then the goodness of God himself is emptied of meaning, and the commands of an omnipotent fiend would have the same claim on us as those of the righteous Lord, right? So Lewis is saying it's important to see goodness as something that has meaning, that's somehow independent of some kind of divine command. I think that God, as it were, to use some language from a writer called Carlton Fisher, I think God, as it were, determines the content of morality by determining the content of creation. Right, that is to say, by making the kind of created world God has made, then God makes a world such that that world flourishes in a particular way. The creatures in that world flourish in a particular way, and so that's what it seems to me is that it is from that basis in creation that goodness and rightness flow. God makes the kind of world God makes, and as a result, some things are right and some things aren't, because it's the kind of world it is. The same-sex marriage business, again, I can talk at considerable length, I guess, about that.
I'm sorry, Gary.
Yeah.
Can I, in regard to the first one, and
Yeah.
if I understand you correctly, you don't argue that basically we are doing moral things because God tells us so. It's just your answer is that we are doing that through the natural law, right? That, in other words, it's intrinsic in us, good and evil, principles of good and evil. Is that correct, or I misunderstood you?
So maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, Peter, or maybe I'm not answering it properly. That is, I think if we do the right thing, we're doing the right thing, I hope, in recognition of what it is to live well in the world, to flourish in the world, and what it is to flourish in the world is a function of the way God has made the world. That's the way I think I want to put it.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Peter. Thank you.
The second, I have
go ahead.
another one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Peter's second question about same-sex marriage, I guess I would say the short version here, it's a short version, is that I think the natural law theorists' arguments, and this is that early article that I mentioned, the first article that I wrote talking about this approach, the natural law theorists' arguments, I think, depend on the view that there's something inherently wrong with purposefully non-procreative sex. And so once you decline to accept that view, and I think join here with, of course, lots of Catholics and with almost all Protestants, then I think the basis for their objection to same-sex marriage, I think, goes away.
Do you think that what in the Bible is it's implied is taking in consideration that there are some accidents happening, or how can we explain? Because the Bible condemns that.
So that's a different conversation, and I think probably a long conversation we're probably not going to have here. So you asked about the article that I mentioned, and that's my crisp summary of that article. But if other people are going to have a chance to talk with me, and I get to the other issues there. Is that okay,
Okay.
Peter? Sorry, we can
Okay,
certainly.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Peter, thank you. I'd like to go to Anastasia now, please.
Mhm.
You're muted, Anastasia. There you go.
Thank you so very much for being here. And my husband and I are looking forward to reading your book. And I'm also delighted as classicists that you have such a deep and broad knowledge and experience. And here's my question. According to Socrates, even for people that, individuals that don't know they're doing good, it's not good for them or for the community, and cannot be doing good, kalon, with all the other attributes underneath his definition of good, unless it's also the good of the community and the individual. And he doesn't say that's the natural law, but he does say that in a way, we're made that way. Therefore, in one of his conversations about good and evil and what one should do with his students, in his dialogue, one of the students asks if they should go ahead and kill somebody who stole or killed somebody else. And his question back is, do we defend evil? Do we defend good with evil? So it's very important that we research and find out what is really good. And if them, like you said, is like Dr. Provoncha said, it's not a fuzzy feeling, you know, in our heart. It's not just eros, but trying to know as much as we can know. So by abdicating for that disaster that happened, those disasters, if we attribute all this to God's providence, which I think humbly, it's so atrocious, it will make me lose faith in God. If he causes that to punish or to whatever, what does it say about the nature of God? Can God do evil? And on the other hand, also, what does that tell us about ourselves? What does it tell about how we treat our environments or prejudices or all those things that do cause things, and then we blame God? So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your very gracious words. I'm not sure that that I deserve all the kind things you've said. When you start out by saying, as a classicist, I think, and then make a comment about what I've said, I think, you know, anything I say about the classical text, I'll probably get wrong. So thank
You
you.
don't. You did very right. Thank you.
Yeah. So in any case, you know, just to think about a few of the things you've said, that observation by Socrates that it is better to suffer evil than to do it, right? That it's better to undergo evil than to try to prevent evil by actually doing evil is a very important observation, and it's one that lies at the root of you know, I think a really important natural law principle that you know, comes to expression famously in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, right?
Yes.
Which says, you know, shall we then do evil that good may come? God forbid. You know, we're not going to do that, and I think that is a very important principle that lies at the root of you know, a variety of, I think, rigorous prohibitions. You know, and maybe this will just be the thing to say of the many things I could say about your observations. Sometimes when we talk about exceptionless prohibitions and bright line rules, People worry that this is some kind of legalistic attack and that it gets in the way of human flourishing and human well-being. But I actually think that the great Protestant ethicist Paul Ramsey, whom we talked about earlier, is onto something very important here. Ramsey says, it is the defender of exceptionless rules who would build a floor under the individual fellow man by minimum faithfulness rules or canons of loyalty to him that are unexceptionable, while it is the proponent of future possible exceptions who may be placing societal and gross consequence values uppermost. And what Ramsey's saying here may not be immediately clear, but what I think he's getting at is that it is precisely when we say we're not going to do evil that good may come. We're going to accept that there are some, of course, some principles are, hold more or less. Do I, if I say I'm going to come to dinner tomorrow at your place, do I have to do that if this happens or that happens? That can be fuzzy. But Ramsey says at least sometimes it's going to be important to say, no, there are some things I simply will not do. It's never going to be right to do. And that's not a matter of, kind of barbarous legalism that just refuses to make adjustments in light of reality. Instead, it's a matter of treating, certainly Ramsey's saying the other person, it can sometimes be a matter also treating ourselves with a kind of respect that means we're not going to violate the integrity of someone in order to bring about something that we think is good. So I think that observation by Socrates, that is parallel there in Romans 3 seems very important indeed. During the rule of a group of dictators in Athens, Socrates was part of a group of people who were ordered by the dictators to go and arrest this person for someone for liquidation, and all the others took off to go arrest this guy. Socrates went home. And
Yes.
Leon of Salamis. And so fortunately, Socrates survived that experience, but he might not have if the dictators hadn't fallen. And the underlying thought here was, yeah, maybe I would have, but I wasn't going to be part of a murder. And so.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Ashley. Okay, I'm going to take one more question, and Rod Corker, and then I'm going to turn it over to David. Good to have you here today, Rod.
Thank you, Forrest. And thank you, Gary, for your provocative presentation here. I had to listen very hard to follow your erudite thinking. I want to make I'm a pragmatist somewhat. So I want to introduce a little pragmatism into this fire situation that David raised. My question, is it reasonable to expect God to intervene in nature? I've just finished reading the trilogy of Brian Bull and Fritz Guy, and they consistently talk about this explainer set of natural regulations, not looking as the ancients did at everything as a product of either God or humans. God has put in very powerful forces in play. They're essential to the world we live in. Natural laws, as you pointed out, water, floods, wind, fire, and ice don't necessarily have an evil intent. They don't have an evil intent. They can be good and they can be bad. These I call deadly blessings. But I would never choose to fight against nature, to pitch myself or my loved ones against nature. Whenever that happens, I think people lose. It's like the last thing a referee tells prize fighters before he steps back is protect yourself at all times. What annoys me about my reflections on the fire is the fire that consumed David's dear friend had no evil intent. It's not what fire and the elements do, but they are potentially dangerous. My annoyance and anger is with the planners that failed, the town planners that failed the population and allowed them to live in such a combustible environment, and it killed so many of them. I hope they learn a lesson there. But this was an avoidable event. It was a human error. and people paid a huge price. But to expect God to intervene when it rains to our annoyance, when a fire comes and threatens our property, when ice settles and destroys our plants, and we think, well, God should intervene against their laws and are natural laws, natural regularities. It doesn't make sense to me. We're asking God to do good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one set of considerations that would absolutely be relevant to thinking about why divine goodness would be such that indeed you wouldn't expect a divine kind of upending of those regularities. I don't think we can know for sure, but it certainly seems to me that that points in one useful direction there. Dave, I'm sure has more to say. But
Okay. All right. Thank you, Gary. And thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to you, David. But I want to say that Gary's book is available on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle and you can get it in hardcover. So
and it's available in the chat.
it's available. Thank you. And available in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay, David, coming to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Forrest. And we're going to turn it over to the Foodless Digital Potluck very shortly. And they will begin, if I remember correctly, with a movie, the first portion of a movie called Trust. And it's a movie about Job, I think. So it follows onto our discussion very well. I would like to add just one thing to the story of the Camp Creek Road fire, and that is it was caused by human negligence.
Yes.
It was the Pacific Gas and Electric Company that did not take care of the transmission lines appropriately. So there was a faulty transmission line, and the wind caused that faulty transmission line to spark, and 240,000 acres burnt up. Now, I take Rodney's point. We can't fight against nature when nature is in control. Rodney's right about that. But when we do something that makes nature needlessly cruel, we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and not at the natural world or God. Now I see Stephen wants to say something, so let's get him in.
Yes, David, I agree with what you just said.
Thank you.
Okay, Stephen.
Yes, thank you. I can tell you, having been a consultant to PG&E from an organizational perspective in years gone by, that's something I wanted to comment earlier when you talked about this whole episode, that evil it happens in a context, and it is perpetrated evil because that's an organization historically that has had callous disregard for people and property on behalf of profit. And they have a history of being one of them, and I can tell you from firsthand experience in interacting with them, one of the most arrogant and callous organizations that I have ever encountered in all my consulting experience. And so that you're absolutely right. That was not just negligence, it was intentional because they didn't want to spend the money to do the maintenance that was needed that could have prevented that. And that's where the evil is, in my view. And so this is not an act of providence. This is an act of human callous disregard for those kinds of potential catastrophes, putting profit well before anything else in their consideration.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah,
It's so
thank you.
good to have a first-hand account of this from a professional who was very close to this corporation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's so valuable. Okay, we'll have the benediction and over to McKinley. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.